Today's episode is something different from usual. Today, I'm going to tell you my process for writing an episode of English 30 Days. A process is the way something is done. I'm going to tell you my process for making the podcast and the best way to learn a language in general. Why? Well, I realize that I have thought a lot about the theory behind the podcast. But I have never shared it with you listeners. Hopefully, this episode will help you better understand how to study languages, and if you are a language teacher, how to teach better. Around the time I started the podcast, I was reading a lot of research on second language acquisition. A second language is one that you learn after your first language, or a native language. So my first language is English, and my second language is French. Technically, you can have a third, fourth, fifth, and so on, but we commonly use the term a second language to refer to any language learned after your first. Acquisition means acquiring, getting something. In this context, it means learning. So second language acquisition is the study of how we learn languages. You might be thinking, why do you use the word acquisition then? Why not just say second language learning? Well, that's because we learn languages in a different way to other things. Usually, when we hear the word learning, we think of reading books, studying and memorization. Memorize means to make yourself remember something. For example, when my parents were at school they had to memorize poems, so that they could say the poems without reading them off the page. But languages are not like that. You can't just memorize all the parts of a language. This is because the skill to acquire a language is innate. When something is innate, it means we have it from birth. We aren't born speaking a language, but everyone is born able to acquire one. So we know that language acquisition is an innate process. We listen to the language around us, people communicate with us, and so we acquire our first language. How we acquire our first language hasn't really changed much in human history, because it works. What doesn't work so well is language teaching, at least for most people. Think of your language classes at school. How many students spoke the language well after years of classes? How many students continued to learn after leaving school? The majority of language teaching remains unchanged from Roman times. For thousands of years, we've understood that there's a set of grammar rules to learn, then you fill in the gaps with vocabulary, and bam! You are speaking a language. But that doesn't usually happen, does it? Now, some of you may have enjoyed this method of teaching. Some people have brains that understand grammar exceptionally well. I'm one of those annoying people. However, you probably spent years studying English without feeling confident in your ability to speak it. In the 1970s, a linguist called Stephen Krashen had a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea in science that someone is trying to prove. For example, there is a famous story about Isaac Newton. Apparently, an apple fell on Isaac Newton's head, and that inspired him to create a hypothesis. His hypothesis was that things are pulled towards the earth, the ground. This hypothesis became the theory of gravity. Stephen Krashen's hypothesis was this: we learn languages by communicating and understanding messages. He called this the theory of comprehensible input. Comprehensible means easy to understand, and input is information that you put into something. For example, when you press a button on your computer, that is input. It tells the computer to do something. When I speak into the microphone, that is also input. The microphone uses sound as input and records it. Stephen Krashen believed that we acquire language by receiving input, reading and listening that is comprehensible, easy to understand. In other words, we learn language when people speak to us in a way we can understand. When we read books we can understand, YT. When we listen to podcasts we can understand him, maybe like this one. And so on. In one of his talks, Stephen Krashen gives an example of an experience that inspired his theory. He was working as director of English as a second language at a university in New York in the 1970s. Next door to his apartment lived a family who had recently moved from Japan. So of course, he tried teaching English to one of the children, a 4-year-old girl called Hitomi. How did he do this? He encouraged Hitomi to practice speaking. First, he told her phrases to say, "Do you like that ball?" But she said nothing. Next, he gave her the words to say, "Ball." Say ball. She said nothing. So then he broke down the words into individual sounds. Ba'alulu. Ball. Still, she said nothing. He tried making a deal with her, making an agreement with her, saying things like, I won't give you the ball until you say the word, ball. By now, you can probably guess that this didn't work. Then, 5 months later, Hitomi started to speak. By the end of the year, Hitomi could speak almost as well as the other kids her age in the neighborhood. So, what happened? Hitomi didn't appear to be learning during her 5-month silence. But she was. She was listening. She was understanding things in context. She was learning language through comprehensible input. You may be thinking, hey, I spend a lot of time watching English TV shows, and it's taken me much longer than 5 months to be able to speak. Consider this. During Hitomi's 5 months in New York, she was constantly exposed to English. Because she was a child, people would try to make things simple for her to understand. For those 5 months, that silent period, Hitomi wasn't speaking, but she was acquiring. And importantly, she was communicating. When people talked to her in English, she didn't just stand there and do nothing. She told people when she understood and when she didn't, and she could answer simple questions. How? The same way we all do as children, by making facial expressions or looking confused, like smiling and using body language. When she was ready, she spoke, and her speaking improved very quickly. Since Krashen published his theory in the 1970s, many other researchers have criticized him. Researchers are scientists who do research, who create and test new hypotheses in science. Researchers often criticize each other. They say that someone else's theory is wrong, that the answer is different. And many researchers in second language acquisition have criticized Krashen's idea of comprehensible input. However, almost all second language acquisition researchers basically agree with Krashen. Often, they call comprehensible input something different, or they consider it part of a wider idea. For example, implicit versus explicit learning. And there is a lot of research that supports Krashen's theory. In 2021, 2 researchers, Karen Lichtman and Bilvan Patton, said that comprehensible input is not a hypothesis, it is a fact. And I agree. While teaching, I've seen so many students who hate learning languages, who find it scary, who have spent years studying vocabulary lists but still feel uncomfortable speaking to a native speaker. On the other hand, when I taught them using comprehensible input, stories, games, conversations and so on, they started to change. They grew more confident, and they began to use the language without thinking about it. So when I started English 5 days, I followed Krashen's theory. As I previously stated, other researchers have contributed to Krashen's work, and significant research on second language acquisition has occurred since the 1970s. However, Krashen's theory is an excellent introduction to the subject, and I believe it is the clearest way to discuss these concepts. If I were teaching this as a university course, I would include more information about other researchers, but this is only an introduction to the topic. If you're interested and want to know more, today's episode is quite scientific, so if you are finding it hard to follow, make sure to take lots of breaks. In fact, why not take a break now? Go get a cup of tea, go to the toilet, or get some food. I'll see you in a bit. So, the theory of comprehensible input is made up of 5 hypotheses. I'm going to explain each of the 5 hypotheses. Then, I'll tell you how they helped me design English 30 days. The first hypothesis is the input hypothesis. The input hypothesis states, state is just a formal way of saying, say the input hypothesis states that people learn language when they understand input that is slightly above their current level, their level right now. You might remember in a previous episode 1 did, Why You Must Read, I talked about reading books where you understand 98% of the words on the page. This is an example of the input hypothesis used practically. We learn best when we understand almost all of the text or audio, but there is a small part that is new. Often, we can figure out what the new thing means, we can understand or guess what the new thing means, because of the context around it. The input hypothesis is often written as I+1. This is a mathematical way of understanding it. I means interlanguage, the form of language that the learner has acquired so far, and +1 foot is the new information that is being added.